Sleepy production design psychology. Kubrick's color palettes. Welcome. Settle in. In this series, the goal is simple. To notice how color palettes can quietly tell you what a character is feeling, hiding, or becoming, often before the character understands it themselves. And we're going to do it through the films of Stanley Kubrick, because Kubrick's work is unusually designed, not just in the sense of production design, sets, props, furniture, materials, but in how all departments align: wardrobe, makeup, lighting, camera, and composition. When those choices point in the same direction, color becomes something more than decoration. It becomes story. Now, Visual Trap. Chapter 6. The Shining Pattern Overload. Carpets, walls, and the anxiety of repetition. In this chapter, we're staying inside The Shining, but we're shifting focus from overall palette to something that works right alongside color: pattern. Because in The Shining, pattern isn't background decoration. It's a psychological tool. The Overlook Hotel is filled with repeating shapes: carpets, wallpaper, architectural lines, tiled floors, fabrics. Those repetitions do something very specific to the viewer. They create rhythm, and rhythm can be soothing until it becomes oppressive. So we're going to look at how repetition and pattern contribute to anxiety, especially when the film combines them with Kubrick's controlled framing and long, steady movement through space. Pattern is not neutral. In production design, pattern is often used to add warmth, texture, cultural identity, period accuracy, or a sense of place. But pattern also affects cognition. Human brains are pattern recognition machines. We constantly scan for repetition and change, because change can signal threat. When you put a character into a pattern space, you're doing more than decorating a room. You're shaping what the character's world feels like: stable or unstable, comforting or claustrophobic, playful or aggressive, orderly or obsessive. In The Shining, the Overlook's patterns often sit right on the edge between decorative and too much. That too much is where dread starts to grow. The carpet as a psychological surface. Carpet is an interesting design choice because it's literally what characters move across. It becomes a constant in the frame, especially in scenes with long tracking shots. When a camera follows a character down a hallway, the carpet pattern becomes a moving field of repetition. It's a visual conveyor belt. And repetition that moves under you has a hypnotic quality. It can pull you into a trance-like viewing state. That's part of why these sequences feel so immersive. But hypnosis can shift into discomfort if the pattern becomes intense enough, or if the environment stops feeling safe. So the carpet isn't just set dressing, it's a psychological floor. Repetition creates closed systems. A repeating pattern suggests a system with rules. When patterns are large-scale and geometric, they can feel architectural, like the design is asserting control. The space is not just decorated, it's governed. In the Overlook, patterns often feel like they belong to the hotel itself, not to the people living there. That's a subtle but important point. When design feels personal, family photos, handmade objects, irregular clutter, it signals human life. When design feels institutional, coordinated motifs, intentional repetition, consistent style, it signals a system. And systems are harder to argue with than people, so pattern contributes to the feeling that the hotel is the dominant force. The anxiety of too consistent. Here's something counterintuitive. An environment can become unsettling when it is too consistent. Real places are messy. Styles clash. Maintenance is imperfect. People leave traces. In the Overlook, many spaces feel curated, preserved, and strongly themed. That can feel impressive, but it can also feel unnatural, like a stage set that never gets lived in. And when characters begin to unravel psychologically, the environment's perfection becomes disturbing because the human is changing, but the hotel stays the same. That mismatch creates tension. The world looks stable while the mind becomes unstable. Pattern reinforces that stability, almost aggressively. Pattern plus symmetry. The trap effect. Now combine pattern with Kubrick's framing style. Kubrick often uses centered compositions and strong perspective, especially in hallways and large interior spaces. When you place a repeating pattern inside a symmetrical frame, the result is very intense. It can feel like the character is pinned to a grid. Even when the character is moving, the environment reads as fixed, repetitive, and inescapable. And psychologically, that suggests confinement. Not necessarily physical confinement at first, but mental confinement, like the mind has fewer exits. Why geometric patterns feel different from organic patterns. Not all patterns create anxiety. Floral patterns, irregular textures, natural motifs often feel softer because they mimic nature's variety. Geometric patterns, especially high contrast ones, feel more rigid and human-made. They can imply structure, order, and control. Many Overlook patterns lean geometric. They're bold, they're graphic, they repeat cleanly. That's why they land psychologically as designed, and why they can feel oppressive in the wrong moment. They don't just fill space, they assert space. Pattern as time distortion. Another effect of repetition is that it can blur your sense of time. When a character moves through similar corridors with similar patterns, the spaces can begin to feel interchangeable. And when spaces feel interchangeable, time can feel looped. That's important in The Shining because part of the dread comes from the sense that the hotel isn't simply a location. It's a kind of psychological maze. Patterns contribute to maze logic, constant repetition, small variations. Difficult to track progress, the feeling that you might be returning to the same point. Even without literal maze imagery, pattern creates the sensation of being inside one. The hotel's visual noise. Pattern can be calming when it's subtle, but when pattern is bold and frequent, carpet plus wallpaper plus furniture fabric plus architectural detail, it creates visual noise. Visual noise taxes attention. It gives your eye less rest. And when your eye has less rest, your body can experience subtle stress. That's part of what people mean when they say a space feels too busy. Even if it's beautifully designed, it can raise arousal without you noticing why. In The Shining, this matters because Kubrick's pacing is often slow, controlled, and quiet, so the environment ends up doing some of the emotional work that music or editing might do in a different film. The film can stay quiet because the room is not quiet. Pattern as history you can't escape. Patterns can also function as a kind of historical residue. Hotels often use repeating motifs to create brand identity, something memorable and consistent, in a place like the Overlook. That consistency can imply that generations of people have passed through the same designed environment. So the pattern becomes a form of permanence. That permanence is unsettling when the story suggests the building has absorbed events, trauma, violence, repetition of human behavior. The pattern says, "This is older than you. This will outlast you." The character's secret, what they're capable of, what they're becoming, starts to feel like it's being pulled into an older, repeating cycle. Pattern and child perspective. Pattern also hits differently, depending on who is moving through the space. When a child moves through a large, patterned environment, scale shifts. The pattern can feel even bigger, more immersive, more engulfing. And that's relevant because The Shining often frames movement through the hotel in a way that emphasizes long corridors, strong repetition, the sense of being guided by the building. Patterns reinforce that experience. They become a visual pathway, and a pathway can feel like direction or like destiny. A practical way to read pattern in the Overlook. If you rewatch the film and want a calm, factual approach to pattern analysis, try this. Count how many patterns are competing in the frame. Carpet, wallpaper, furniture, curtains, tile, artwork. The more layers, the more intensity. Notice contrast inside the pattern. High contrast patterns grab attention and increase tension. Low contrast patterns recede and calm. Watch whether the pattern is stable or moving. When the camera tracks, the pattern scrolls under you. That movement can become hypnotic or stressful, depending on context. Notice when a patterned environment contains a small human figure. If the person looks visually swallowed by the pattern, the environment is winning. Kim. This isn't subjective guesswork. It's how visual design affects attention and arousal. What pattern reveals about the characters? In a film like The Shining, the Overlook's design can function like an externalization of inner states. As the story progresses, pattern and repetition can start to feel like obsession, looping thoughts, mental confinement, loss of orientation, loss of individuality. That's why pattern becomes part of character psychology. The hotel's repeating motifs mirror the way a mind can get stuck. Same thought, same fear, same impulse, repeating. The environment doesn't just contain the characters, it echoes them. The takeaway for this chapter. So here's the central point. In The Shining, pattern overload is not simply style. It's a psychological pressure system. Repetition creates rhythm. Rhythm creates hypnosis. And when the story removes safety, that hypnosis becomes dread. Carpets and walls stop being decoration and start behaving like a trap. An orderly, beautiful trap that keeps repeating itself. In the next chapter, we'll pivot into A Clockwork Orange, where color and design do something very different. The world becomes bright, playful, and pop, while the moral experience becomes darker. That contrast is another kind of psychological weapon, and it's one Kubrick uses with ruthless precision. Chapter 7, A Clockwork Orange, Pop Color versus Moral Rot, When the World Looks Too Fun. Now the tone changes. After the controlled sterility of 2001 and the warm but uncanny trap of The Shining, A Clockwork Orange brings in something visually louder, pop color, bold design, and a kind of playful modernism. And that's exactly the point. The design psychology of A Clockwork Orange relies on a harsh contradiction. The world looks fun. The behavior inside it is not. This is one of the most effective uses of color in Kubrick's work, because it exploits a viewer expectation most people don't even realize they have. Bright color often gets read as safe, youthful, energetic, stylized, even comic. Kubrick uses that instinct, then forces the viewer to sit with what happens when a fun palette frames moral collapse. Pop color as emotional misdirection. High saturation and strong color contrast tend to feel high energy. They can make images feel contemporary, bold, and visually alive. In A Clockwork Orange, the visual world often leans into that intensity, especially in interiors and designed environments. The palette is not trying to disappear into realism. It wants to be noticed. That has a psychological effect. The viewer's senses get activated, and when sensory activation meets disturbing content, the experience becomes disorienting. The brain tries to reconcile two messages at once. The environment signals playfulness. The narrative signals danger and violation. That dissonance is part of what makes the film feel so confrontational. The environment as a moral mask. In production design terms, a pleasant palette can act like packaging. Packaging tells you how to feel about what's inside. Bright color, clean surfaces, graphic shapes. Those can signal modernity, trendiness, and even safety. A Clockwork Orange uses design like deceptive packaging. The built world can look stylized and visually appealing, even while the behavior is brutal. This creates a specific kind of discomfort. The film denies the viewer an easy aesthetic escape. The design doesn't allow the viewer to categorize the story as simply grim, and therefore emotionally simple. Instead, the world can feel seductive. Then the seduction becomes part of the problem. High contrast as conflict. A lot of the film's visual energy comes from strong contrasts. Light against dark. Bold colors against neutral backdrops. Graphic shapes that read quickly. High contrast creates visual clarity. Clarity can feel decisive, even authoritative. But in moral terms, the story is not clear. It's chaotic and unstable. So the design becomes a kind of false certainty. The image looks confident. The world inside it is not. That tension is one reason the palette feels aggressive. It's not just bright, it's insistent. Modern interiors and the design life. One important context for the film's look is that it presents a future, or an alternate present, that feels designed and controlled. Not sterile like 2001, but consumer designed, stylized, curated. This matters because a consumer designed world suggests a culture where surfaces are prioritized. The look of things, the experience of things, the display of things. And that becomes psychological framing for character behavior. If a society is obsessed with surface, it can also become desensitized to substance. So the bright palette isn't simply aesthetic. It can suggest a world where stimulation is constant and moral consequence is muted. Color and the problem of glamour. Here's the uncomfortable truth that A Clockwork Orange plays with. Color can glamorize. Even when the story is condemning behavior, a visually striking palette can make scenes feel heightened and memorable in a way that viewers sometimes interpret as cool. That's one reason this film remains controversial. The design is powerful enough that it can be read as seductive. Kubrick's strategy isn't to make ugliness look ugly, it's to make ugliness look presentable. And that is a psychological statement. A society can normalize violence not only through laws and systems, but through aesthetics, through style, through repetition, through entertainment logic. The palette as a false party. When a film uses bright color, it can create a party-like energy, a sense of speed, youth, irreverence. In A Clockwork Orange, that energy becomes a trap. The brightness doesn't bring joy. It brings a kind of nausea because it frames scenes where joy should not exist. So, when the world looks too fun, the viewer is forced to confront a question that's central to the film's psychology. Is the culture itself complicit in treating harm like spectacle? This is where production design becomes social commentary, not with speeches, just by choosing a palette that refuses to match moral reality. Controlled weirdness, stylization as distance. Another design psychology layer. Stylization can create distance. When a film looks very stylized, the viewer can experience it as less real. That can lower defenses. It can create a sense of this is a fable or this is an exaggerated world. Kubrick uses stylization as a kind of anesthesia, then removes the anesthesia by making the content too human to ignore. So the palette is doing two jobs at once. It creates distance by stylizing the world. It creates discomfort by refusing to soften the consequences. That's why the experience can feel unsettling even when the visuals are crisp and designed. Color as identity, characters as visual statements. In a highly stylized film, characters can become graphic elements, strong silhouettes, strong costume choices, strong contrasts. That can make characters feel iconic, recognizable, and that's a design psychology issue all by itself. When a character becomes iconic, the viewer can start to treat them like a symbol rather than a person. Kubrick plays right on that edge. The design makes identity feel like something worn, like a costume, a uniform, a brand. And when identity becomes a brand, morality can become a performance rather than a core. So the palette can reveal a character's secret in a specific way. It suggests that the character's self is partly constructed through style, through how they appear in the world, rather than through empathy or internal restraint. Bright palettes and emotional bluntness. In color psychology terms, a highly saturated environment can overwhelm subtle emotion. It can flatten nuance. That doesn't mean people can't feel nuance inside a bright world. It means the visual message is loud. In A Clockwork Orange, the loudness of the environment can mirror a kind of emotional bluntness, impulse over reflection, stimulation over meaning, spectacle over consequence. This doesn't require the film to state it. The palette makes the viewer feel a constant push. A practical way to watch this chapter's idea. If you rewatch A Clockwork Orange and want to keep the analysis grounded, focus on 3 observable things. saturation level? How often does the film live in intense color rather than muted tones? Contrast. How sharp are the separations between light and dark and color blocks? Emotional mismatch. When the palette feels playful, what is the scene asking you to tolerate? That mismatch is the engine. The takeaway for this chapter. So, the core design psychology of A Clockwork Orange is this. A bright, pop-forward palette can function as moral misdirection. It can package disturbing behavior in a visually appealing world, forcing the viewer to confront how easily style can soften judgment. In this film, the world looks too fun on purpose, and that reveals the character's secret, not as a hidden fact, but as a condition. When culture becomes addicted to stimulation, cruelty can start to look like entertainment. In the next chapter, the focus tightens further. Costume and color as symbolism, especially how stark black and white contrasts can turn innocence into something theatrical, performative, and deeply unreliable. Chapter 8, A Clockwork Orange. White uniforms, black hats, innocence as costume. In this chapter, we're going to narrow in on a very specific design strategy in A Clockwork Orange. How costume and palette work together to create the appearance of cleanliness, order, or even innocence, and how that appearance becomes part of the film's psychological confrontation. Because the film doesn't only use color to set mood, it uses color to build identity as performance. And few things communicate performance faster than a uniform. Why uniforms are such a powerful design tool. In visual storytelling, a uniform does three things immediately. It turns a character into a symbol. It suggests group membership and shared rules. It reduces individuality, or at least compresses it, into a few controlled details. Uniforms create instant legibility. The viewer doesn't need dialogue to understand. These people are aligned. They move as a unit. They represent something. In A Clockwork Orange, that instant legibility is used as a trap, because what looks organized and designed becomes a mask for behavior that is chaotic and morally corrosive. The psychological effect of white. Let's start with the dominant color in the gang's look, white. White is one of the most loaded colors in design because it's often associated with cleanliness, purity, youth, neutrality, sterility, and blankness, as in a reset or an empty page. In real-world systems, white also shows up in contexts where control matters. Hospitals and labs, ceremonial clothing, institutional uniforms, minimalist modernism, product design and packaging. So when you put characters in white, you're borrowing all of those associations, whether consciously or not. That's why white is effective as misdirection. It's a color that can suggest harmless or fresh, even when the person wearing it is neither. And in this film, that misdirection becomes part of the point. White as the illusion of moral cleanliness. When a character commits harm, the viewer tends to look for visual cues that match the harm. Darkness, grime, chaos, rough textures. Kubrick refuses that easy alignment. The clean look makes the viewer confront a disturbing possibility. A person can look spotless and still be dangerous. A culture can look stylish and still be rotten. So the white costume doesn't soften the violence. It highlights the disconnect between appearance and reality. It's not white equals innocent. It's white equals the performance of innocence. Black as authority and punctuation. Now pair that white with a key contrast. Black. Black accessories, especially headwear, carry a different set of associations. Authority, formality, tradition, and a kind of visual finality. Black is a punctuation color. It gives edges. It gives silhouette. It makes shapes feel decisive. So when you combine white clothing with black headwear, you get a highly readable graphic statement. The characters become icons, almost like signage. And that matters psychologically, because icons are easy to detach from humanity. The more designed a person becomes, the easier it can be, emotionally, to treat them like a character in a performance rather than a real human being, making real choices. The film uses that detachment to make the viewer uncomfortable with their own viewing position. The costume adds branding. There's another layer here that's very practical. The look is branded. You can recognize it instantly. That's not accidental. Strong costume design functions the way logos function. It creates instant identity. When identity becomes branding, behavior can start to feel like a role. And when behavior becomes a role, morality can become optional. Because the character isn't being, they're performing. So the design psychology isn't simply, they dress in a striking way. It's, they dress in a way that turns them into a concept. And concepts can be used by the story, by the culture, by institutions. The unsettling neatness of symmetry in costume. A uniform doesn't only unify the group, it also creates a kind of symmetry. Even if the characters are moving chaotically, the costumes create visual order. And visual order can suggest control. That's another contradiction Kubrick exploits. The image suggests control. The behavior suggests impulse. The costume makes the group feel organized, even when they're morally disorganized. That contradiction is where discomfort grows. White as blankness, the erased self. White can also mean blankness, an erased surface. In that sense, white can suggest that identity is not developed internally. It's worn externally. That's especially relevant in a film concerned with control, conditioning, and the struggle between free will and imposed behavior. A blank costume can imply a person who is ready to be ridden on by peers, by culture, by the state. So the costume can work like a visual foreshadowing. It suggests that identity in this world is malleable, and that systems will try to reshape it. Clean costume, dirty meaning. One of the most direct ways the film uses costume psychology is simply contrast. When the visual design signals cleanliness, while the story signals cruelty, the viewer experiences cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance is a fancy term for a simple feeling. Two things are true at the same time, and your brain doesn't like it. This looks neat. This is not neat. And because your brain wants to resolve that conflict, you start searching for meaning. That's exactly what strong design does. It forces interpretation. The film turns costume into an argument about how easily people mistake aesthetic order for moral order. The problem of theatrical innocence. White and black styling can also read as theatrical, like costumes for a performance. Theatricality creates distance. Distance makes cruelty easier to watch because it can feel stylized, removed, not real. Kubrick uses theatricality to critique theatricality. He gives you a look that could be read as playful or exaggerated, then makes you face what happens when play contains real harm. So the costume becomes part of the film's uncomfortable question. When violence is packaged as style, how does that change what an audience tolerates? A design lesson. Color meaning comes from context, not intention. If you take this costume palette out of the film and put it into a different context, say a clean, minimalist fashion shoot, the meaning shifts. It might read as modern, sharp, youthful. In A Clockwork Orange, the exact same palette reads as menacing, not because white and black are inherently menacing, but because the film attaches them to behavior and repetition. This is a good design lesson in general. Colors don't come with fixed meanings. They pick up meaning through association. So, as the film continues, the white doesn't become dirty visually. It becomes dirty psychologically because you've learned what it contains. What to watch for. The costume's relationship to the environment. Here's a grounded way to watch this chapter's idea without drifting into speculation. When the group appears, notice 3 measurable things. Separation from background. Does the white pop sharply against the environment? High contrast creates dominance. Graphic clarity. How quickly can you read the silhouette? The faster you can read it, the more the costume functions like a symbol. Consistency. How stable is the look across scenes? Stability in costume creates identity. Identity becomes brand. Brand becomes meaning. Then notice how you feel when you see the look again. If your body tenses at the sight of a clean costume, that's design psychology working. The character secret this reveals. So, what secret does this palette reveal about character? Not a plot secret, a psychological one. The costume suggests that the character's self is partly constructed as an image, a controlled aesthetic meant to project something: coolness, unity, confidence, purity, authority. But the behavior reveals that the image is empty as morality. So the secret is this: the innocence is a costume, the cleanliness is packaging, the order is aesthetic, not ethical. And in a film that's deeply interested in how systems shape humans, that idea matters. Because if identity is mostly performance, it becomes easier for systems, peer groups, institutions, governments, to change behavior by changing conditions. The takeaway for this chapter. In A Clockwork Orange, the white uniform and black accents aren't just memorable style. They are a psychological device. They create instant identity, visual order, and the appearance of cleanliness. Then the film uses that appearance to force a confrontation with a darker truth. A clean palette can hide moral rot, and a uniform can turn a person into a symbol, making cruelty easier to package, repeat, and normalize. In the next chapter, we move into Barry Lyndon, where the palette shifts again into candlelit, painterly tones. The design becomes exquisite and historically grounded, but the psychology remains sharp. Beauty can be a cage, and warmth can still be suffocation. Chapter 9, Barry Lyndon. Candlelight palettes, beauty that traps you in the frame. Now we move into Barry Lyndon, and the visual experience changes immediately. Compared to the bold pop contrast of A Clockwork Orange and the patterned pressure of The Shining, Barry Lyndon feels restrained, painterly and controlled in a different way. The palette is often muted. The interiors feel warm but not cozy. The composition feels elegant but not forgiving. This is one of Kubrick's most useful films for understanding how color can communicate something that isn't loud at all: social control. Because in Barry Lyndon, the secret isn't a hidden weapon or a supernatural threat. The threat is status. The threat is the system of class. The threat is being watched and evaluated in rooms designed for judgment. And the palette is a major part of that. The candlelight look as emotional design. A defining feature of Barry Lyndon is its relationship to light, especially interior scenes that feel like they're lit by candles or warm practical sources. That candlelit quality does something specific to color. It pushes whites toward cream. It turns bright colors into softened versions of themselves. It makes shadows rich and dense. It creates a narrow, warm range where everything feels bathed in amber. This isn't just a period look. It's a psychological environment. Candlelight is flattering to surfaces: wood, skin, fabric, gold. It smooths the world. It romanticizes. It feels like memory. But it also limits visibility. It creates pockets of darkness. It makes the environment feel controlled by whoever owns the light. So candlelight can feel intimate and beautiful, while also functioning like a constraint. Painterly palettes, beauty as a system. The film often feels composed like a painting, even without naming any specific painter. You can observe the design logic. Carefully balanced frames, strong attention to placement, and a sense that everything is arranged. A painterly palette tends to avoid modern intensity. You don't get a lot of neon. You don't get sharp, contemporary contrast. You get creams, browns, and deep reds, softened greens and blues, golds and muted metallics, black used with formality rather than aggression. This palette creates a feeling of refinement, and refinement psychologically often implies rules, because refinement isn't just taste, it's behavior. It's a system of correctness. It tells you what is acceptable. It tells you how to sit, how to speak, how to dress, how to move. So, in this film, the palette isn't simply pretty. It's a visual code for social structure. The difference between warmth and comfort. This is important. Barry Lyndon is warm, but it isn't comforting. Warmth here is aesthetic. It's visual warmth, amber light, golden tones, rich materials. Comfort would imply safety, belonging, permission to be imperfect. But the spaces in Barry Lyndon often feel formal, observational, like the room has an opinion about you. So the warmth becomes part of the trap. It's not warmth that welcomes you. It's warmth that displays you. Color as class. Who gets to be beautiful? In a period story, palette is never only emotional, it's also economic. Certain colors historically require resources: dyes, fabrics, tailoring, maintenance. Certain materials require labor. Certain finishes require wealth. Even without getting into technical history, the basic point is visible. Some characters occupy spaces with richer, more controlled palettes than others. And the design psychology is direct. The higher the status, the more curated the environment. The more curated the environment, the less freedom you have to be human inside it. A highly controlled palette signals a world where appearance is not optional. It's survival. The palette's restraint as moral pressure. Because the palette is muted and refined, it creates a feeling of restraint. Restraint can read as dignity. It can also read as suppression. In Barry Lyndon, that restraint often supports the idea that emotions must be managed, especially in public spaces. Rooms are designed to be seen. People are designed to be seen. And when people live inside an environment where they're constantly being seen, they begin to behave like objects. Polished, careful, controlled. So the palette becomes a visual reinforcement of performance. It's not just how the world looks, it's how the world expects you to look. Composition and palette being trapped in a picture. Here's where Kubrick's visual control connects directly to psychology. When the frame feels like a painting, the characters can start to feel pinned in place, like figures arranged for an audience. A painterly palette supports that effect because it reduces harshness. It smooths transitions. It makes the image feel complete. A complete image can feel final. So instead of feeling like you're watching life unfolding, you can feel like you're watching a tableau, an arranged display. That sensation is not neutral. It suggests that characters are living inside a story already written by social rules. And that's the trap. Beauty becomes a frame you can't step out of. Reds and golds. Prestige without warmth. When reds and golds appear in this film, they often function as prestige signals. Red can imply wealth and power. Gold implies status and permanence. But in Barry Lyndon, those colors don't necessarily feel emotionally warm, even when they are visually warm, because prestige isn't affection. Prestige is hierarchy. So the palette can suggest richness while still carrying an emotional coldness, because the richness belongs to the system, not to the person. The museum feeling. Many viewers describe certain scenes in Barry Lyndon as museum-like, not because the sets feel fake, but because the world feels preserved. A preserved world has a psychological consequence. It feels like the characters are living inside something that will not change for them. And that relates directly to the character psychology of ambition. If you're in a system that doesn't change, then the only way to survive is to climb. The palette reinforces the idea of permanence. These rooms are older than you, and they will remain after you. You're only passing through. So the character's secret becomes a kind of quiet desperation. Not everyone wants love. Some people want security. Some people want position. Some people want to stop being vulnerable. And the palette supports that motivation. It makes status look stable. It makes wealth look like safety. Costume palettes, blending in versus standing out. Costume in this film often appears integrated with the environment. That integration can signal belonging, at least visually. But belonging is complicated in a class system because you can look correct and still be wrong. A restrained palette can show you that. Blending in is a skill, and standing out is a risk. In a highly structured social world, too much color can read as vulgar or dangerous. Too little can read as low status or invisibility. So the palette becomes a social language, and characters are constantly speaking it with their bodies. Candlelight as selective truth. Another practical point about candlelight palettes. Warm, low light can hide details. It can make imperfections less visible. It can soften expressions. It can make the environment feel kinder than it is. That can support a psychological theme. People can hide better in warm, flattering light. Not because they're safe, because they're staged. So, candlelight becomes part of the film's emotional ambiguity. It romanticizes the world, while the story shows how brutal that world can be. A viewer exercise. Read beauty as pressure. If you want to keep this chapter grounded in observable design choices, try this while watching. Look at how limited the palette is in many interiors. The range is controlled. That suggests behavior is controlled. Notice how often characters are arranged in composed, balanced frames. That suggests they are being evaluated. Pay attention to how warmth can coexist with emotional distance. Warm light doesn't guarantee warmth between people. This is the design psychology of aristocratic environments. Beauty is not always kindness. Beauty can be discipline. The takeaway for this chapter. So here's the central idea of Barry Lyndon in palette terms. The candlelight look creates warmth, refinement, and nostalgia. But that beauty functions like a frame, something that displays people and limits them. In this film, the palette tells you a quiet character secret. The world is so beautifully ordered that a person can confuse status with safety. And once you do, you can spend your life trying to climb into the picture, only to realize the picture is also a cage. In the next chapter, we'll shift to Full Metal Jacket, where the palette becomes more institutional, greens, grays, and muted tones. And the design psychology sharpens into something blunt. Identity erasure, conformity, and the way environments can grind individuality down to function. Chapter 10, Full Metal Jacket. Greens, grays, and identity erasure, the palette of conformity. Now we arrive at Full Metal Jacket, and the palette shifts again, away from the painterly warmth of Barry Lyndon and into something more institutional. This film is especially useful for palette psychology because it's structured in two major environments that feel psychologically different: the training world and the war world. The colors, materials, and visual texture of each environment help you feel what the characters are becoming before they say it out loud. When people talk about the look of Full Metal Jacket, they often remember the harshness: uniforms, shaved heads, fluorescent lit interiors, concrete, dust, smoke, ruined buildings. The design is not trying to charm you, it's trying to flatten you, and that flattening is the point. Institutional color. What the system wants from a person. In design psychology, institutional palettes tend to be limited and practical. Muted greens, grays, off-whites, browns, and colors that read as functional rather than expressive. These palettes show up in places where individuality is not the priority. Military environments, factories, bureaucracies, hospitals, large public systems. They're efficient, they're repeatable, they're easy to maintain, and visually, they communicate a value. The system comes first. In Full Metal Jacket, that palette becomes a kind of behavioral instruction. The environments look like they're built to produce a certain kind of human: controlled, obedient, emotionally narrowed, designed for function. Green as camouflage and as identity reduction. Let's talk about green because it carries two meanings at once in this context. The obvious meaning is camouflage. Green connects to the natural world, to concealment, to blending in. But psychologically, green in military contexts can become something else. It can be the color of not standing out. Camouflage isn't only visual, it's social. When everyone is wearing the same palette, the message is, your body is part of a unit. Your choices are limited. Your personal identity is irrelevant compared to the role. So the palette is doing identity work, even when the characters are still individuals internally. The design is already asking the viewer to see them as components. Grays and neutrals, the flattening of emotional range. Gray is one of the most psychologically flattening colors in design. It can feel neutral, corporate, lifeless, serious, or numb depending on context. In Full Metal Jacket, gray appears in materials and spaces that feel hard: concrete, metal, bare rooms, industrial surfaces, worn down architecture. Those neutrals reduce emotional cues. They don't comfort. They don't invite softness. They don't suggest personal life. This matters because the film is heavily concerned with what happens when a human being is pushed into a narrow emotional lane. A restricted palette supports that sensation. The world feels stripped down, and the people inside it start to feel stripped down too. The training environment, clean control, harsh clarity. In the training portion of the film, the world often feels controlled in a way that is clean, repetitive, and bright. Not cozy bright, exposing bright. Bright, even lighting in institutional spaces can feel like surveillance. It removes shadows. It makes everything visible. It limits privacy. And when you combine that with uniform color, repeating beds, repeating lockers, repeating bodies, repeating routines, you get an environment that feels designed to erase difference. Repetition is one of the strongest visual signals of system. It says, individuals are interchangeable. So the training environment isn't just a setting, it's a visual argument. This system is designed to manufacture sameness. Uniforms as the ultimate palette decision. A uniform is the most direct palette choice a story can make because it pushes costume into the role of environment. The character's body becomes part of the set. In a film about the military, uniforms aren't a stylistic flourish, they're the point. And psychologically, uniforms do something very specific. They reduce the amount of visual information available about a person's inner life. In everyday life, people express identity through color choices, textures, accessories, personal items. The uniform removes most of that. So the viewer is trained to read characters less through personal expression and more through behavior, position in the hierarchy, voice, compliance or resistance, and eventually survival. That's identity reduction in visual form. Hair and skin, when the human becomes part of the machine. Even beyond clothing, the training world narrows individuality through grooming and presentation. When hair becomes standardized and bodies are presented in uniform ways, the film reduces the number of personal markers available to you. It doesn't eliminate humanity, but it compresses it. That compression can feel cold because the normal signals of a person's personal life, style, variation, softness, are missing. In design terms, it's like stripping a room of personal objects. The room might still function, but it stops telling a story about the person who lives there. The palette of authority, who controls the space. Institutional spaces often communicate authority through contrast, crisp lines, clean divisions, clear sightlines, and minimal clutter. When authority controls a space, the space is legible. It's designed to be supervised. That's why training environments in films often feel visually orderly, even when emotions are not. The palette supports that authority. Neutrals and muted colors suggest seriousness, discipline, and control. So even before conflict peaks, the world is already telling you. The system is stronger than the individual. Then the film shifts. War as broken design. As the film moves into the war environment, the palette changes in texture more than in hue. You still see many muted tones, but now they're mixed with dust, smoke, damaged surfaces, burned out materials, debris, and environments that no longer behave like stable architecture. This creates a different psychological feeling. In training, the environment is controlled and intact. In war, the environment is chaotic and collapsing. But here's the twist. Even when the environment becomes visually chaotic, the palette often remains restrained. It doesn't suddenly become colorful in a way that would feel emotionally expressive. So you get a bleak combination. The world is breaking, but the palette stays emotionally narrow. That narrowness reinforces numbness. Ruins, not warmth. The absence of home colors. One of the strongest psychological cues in war design is the absence of home colors. Home palettes tend to include signals of softness, warm lamps, textiles, personal objects, varied color choices, imperfect clutter, signs of life. Or in Full Metal Jacket, many environments are missing those cues. The spaces are often hard, open, stripped, damaged, or temporary. Even when a room has objects in it, those objects don't read as comfort. They read as remnants. So the viewer is kept in a palette that feels emotionally deprived. And that deprivation mirrors the character experience. Survival becomes the primary function, and the world stops supporting anything beyond function. Color as moral distance. When a palette becomes dominated by muted greens and grays, it can create a kind of moral distance. Bright colors can activate empathy because they feel human and specific, like someone chose them for pleasure. Muted institutional palettes feel impersonal, like someone chose them for efficiency. In a story about violence and survival, an impersonal palette can make events feel like procedure rather than tragedy. That doesn't excuse the violence. It changes how the viewer processes it. So the palette becomes part of the film's emotional strategy. It keeps you in a world where feeling too much would be difficult, because the environment doesn't offer you emotional handholds. Identity erasure becomes the character secret. Across this series, we've been talking about character secrets as psychological truths revealed through design. In Full Metal Jacket, the secret is blunt. The system doesn't want unique people. It wants functioning units. The palette, greens, grays, neutrals, supports that truth. It reduces expressive range. It turns bodies into a field of similar tones. It emphasizes conformity visually, even when characters resist internally. And the war environment adds another layer. Even after training ends, the visual narrowing continues. The world stays muted, the architecture breaks. The palette doesn't open up into emotional relief. So the film's design tells you something steady and unsettling. The system doesn't stop shaping you when the rules dissolve. It stays inside you. A practical viewing exercise. Watch what the palette removes. If you want to keep this analysis grounded, here's a simple exercise for rewatching Full Metal Jacket. Ask yourself, what colors are rare? Which hues almost never appear? Scarcity tells you what the world refuses to allow. Where do you see personal color, if you see it at all? When a personal color appears, does it feel out of place? Does it feel fragile? What materials dominate the frame? Soft materials suggest comfort. Hard materials suggest function and endurance. How often does the environment feel lived in versus operated in? Lived in spaces tell personal stories. Operated in spaces tell system stories. These questions keep you in observable design choices, palette, material, and spatial behavior. Closing the series, Kubrick's palettes as systems. And now, stepping back for a moment, you can see the through line across all 5 films. In 2001, sterile whites and clean and color blocks make humans feel small inside a perfect system. In The Shining, warm hospitality palettes and repeating patterns make comfort feel like containment. In A Clockwork Orange, pop color makes moral collapse feel disturbingly packaged and normalized. In Barry Lyndon, candlelit warmth turns beauty into social pressure. An Elegant Cage. In Full Metal Jacket, muted institutional palettes turn people into components and narrow emotional life into function. Kubrick's palettes aren't just aesthetics, they're environments with rules. So the final takeaway of Full Metal Jacket is simple and factual. When a film limits its palette to institutional greens, grays, and harsh neutrals, it can visually communicate conformity, surveillance, and identity reduction before the story explains it. And in this film, that palette doesn't merely describe the military. It demonstrates what a system can do to a person, not by shouting, but by quietly removing color, until the world feels like it has fewer and fewer places for a human self to hide. As we come to the end of this video, the big idea is surprisingly simple. In Kubrick, color isn't decoration, color is structure. Across these 5 films, the palettes aren't just pretty or iconic. They behave like systems with rules, rules that shape how a character can exist inside the world. In 2001, the clean whites and calm color blocks feel like progress, but they also feel like emotional streamlining. Humans moving inside a machine that doesn't need their inner life. And then Hal's red arrives like a friendly status light, until repetition turns it into something else. A presence, a warning, a reminder that the system is watching. In The Shining, the warmth is the trick. Wood, amber light, rich reds, everything signals hospitality. But the space is too big, too empty, too controlled. And then the patterns take over. Repetition becomes pressure. The hotel starts to feel less like a building and more like a loop you can't think your way out of. In A Clockwork Orange, Kubrick flips the weapon. The world looks fun. Pop color, graphic contrast, stylish surfaces, design that feels like packaging. And that's the point. When cruelty is wrapped in style, it becomes easier to tolerate, easier to repeat, easier to turn into spectacle. Even the costumes become branding, clean white, sharp black. Innocence as a costume, identity as performance. Then Barry Lyndon brings us into candlelight and refinement, beauty that looks like comfort but behaves like judgment. The palette is warm, but it isn't safe. It's a frame that displays you, its status turned into atmosphere. You can climb into the picture and still find out it's a cage. And finally, Full Metal Jacket strips the palette down to function. Greens, grays, institutional neutrals. Color becomes conformity. The world narrows. Identity gets compressed into role, unit, procedure, until even chaos doesn't feel expressive. It just feels stripped. So if you take one thing from this series, let it be this. Palettes don't just show you what a world looks like. They show you what a world expects. They tell you what's permitted, what's suppressed, what's watched, what's rewarded, what's punished. And once you start seeing color this way, you can't unsee it. Not in Kubrick, not in any film, because every set, every costume, every light choice is quietly answering a question the character may never say out loud. Who am I allowed to be in this room? Thanks for listening. And if you want to keep going, the next video in this Sleepy Design Psychology series will take one film at a time, slower, deeper, so we can look at specific scenes and exactly how the palette shifts moment by moment, like a secret being revealed without anyone speaking.